You're not going to remain standing for the sermon? Okay, you can sit. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming back out tonight, those of you who are new with us, and just great to have you here. It's always nice to enjoy fresh seasons. Every season brings with it something wonderful. My family spent a little bit of time taking a walk this afternoon, right after the terrible rain and wind, and it was so cool. And I thought, this is a preview. What's that?
Terrible. Who says terrible?
I heard somebody. We took a walk through the cool, and we thought, oh, this is a preview of coming attractions, you know? And of course, as soon as it starts getting that way all the time, we'll wish we were back in summer again. But appreciating every season, and this is the beginning of a new season that brings in fresh faces, and just grateful to have you all here. Tonight we're looking at the end of Genesis, which is the story of Joseph. And we're paralleling some key themes with what we see in these chapters. For example, we've seen that God gives hope, God gives forgiveness, and tonight we're looking at how God gives family. And we're going to be in Genesis 46 through 50 tonight. But I want to begin with a verse in the book of Psalms, Psalm 68 and verse 6. The only version that I know that brings out the point I want to make in this passage is the New International Version. I want to tell you something we learned in school. If you search through 50 translations, and you can only find one that makes the point you want to make, you're probably not being fair to the text. But I'm going to do it anyway. Why? Because it's a point that's biblical, even if it isn't what this psalm necessarily was trying to bring out. I like the way it's worded. I want to bring out the wording, and you'll see why it's biblical. And this is the passage, Psalm 68:6, and the NIV says, God sets the lonely in families. I love that quote. I'll use that when I'm talking with someone who's having a difficult time. Maybe they've lost someone dear to them, or a terrible breakup or something. And we'll talk about who can you turn to in these situations. And almost always, it's some family member that's there for them. And we talk about God sets the lonely in families. Here's the rest of the verse. God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. Now, if you have an NIV, you'll notice a little asterisk or a star by the word families. And it will say, here's another way to translate this phrase, probably the phrase you'll see in most other translations. It says, or it could be, God sets the desolate in a homeland. Okay, I like the phrase, God sets the lonely in families in counseling situations. But if it really more likely is, God sets the desolate in a homeland, what a wonderfully fitting passage in both senses to explain the end of Genesis. Because God gives family back to Joseph. And God gives Joseph back to Jacob. And wouldn't you know it, it involves the desolate in a homeland, traveling through a sun-scorched land before they find it. Genesis 46, verses 1 through 7, Jacob finds assurance, and then he begins his sojourn. Let's read Genesis 46, 1 through 7. Listen as I read aloud. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him. his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. This is a setup. The beginning of chapter 46 is meant to tell the reader, who may have some inkling that Exodus is on the horizon, that things could have been different. In fact, they were different. There was a time when people brought their good things into Egypt before they were running out of Egypt with them. A time when Pharaoh provided the necessary resources to bring Israel into the land before the new Pharaoh is pushing them out of the land. And it begins with a vision of God. The technical term for this in the Old Testament is a theophany. It's when God shows up, where you have a vision of God. And isn't it striking that in all these chapters about Joseph, we actually haven't seen one of these yet? The closest you get is the dreams, right? A dream, and you're supposed to interpret the dream. But where God shows up and says, hey, I'm God, I want to talk with you. We don't see that with Joseph. We see it with Jacob. And I wonder what we do with that. It parallels in some ways the voice of God in Genesis 12 to Jacob's grandfather, where God says to Abraham, I will show you the land you need to go to. I will make you a great nation. I will give you more children than you can imagine. God speaks to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a way different than he does with Joseph. And so we have a vision of God, and we need it, because leaving the land of promise does not negate or jeopardize the promise. It was God who spoke to Abraham and said, I'm going to show you the land you're supposed to go to. So you needed God to show up to Jacob and say, it's okay to leave. Because the real promise isn't the land. The real promise is me. And that's what makes the land valuable. Where I am, you will be, and where you are, I will be. So there's a vision of God. And then I want you to notice that God says, don't be afraid in verse 3. Oh, this is one of God's favorite catchphrases. To Abraham in Genesis 15 and verse 1, God said, don't be afraid. To Isaac at Beersheba in Genesis 26 and verse 24, he said, don't be afraid. God is going to fulfill his promise of a great nation. He said it to Abraham, he said it to Isaac, and now he's saying it to Jacob. But interestingly enough, he's saying, I am going to fulfill my promise there. There. And you and I, the reader, knowing Exodus is on the horizon, knowing we're about to hear about a tragic story, are supposed to have somewhere in the back of our heads this idea. God is going to keep his promise. The ways of the world, the ways of the pharaohs of the world will not thwart God's plans or God's intentions. The promise of God will come true. Trust me, God says, I'm going to fulfill my promise even there. Don't be afraid. He promises he'll be with Israel. And of course, he's talking about a person, Jacob. But if you're reading this and you're wandering in the wilderness, it's comforting to know God will be with Israel. And I want you to notice it also shifts from person to nation. There's a reason why Jacob is called Israel in this passage over and over. The writer wants you to start making the jump, because Jacob's not going to live forever. But the promises made to Jacob are promises to God's people, and so let's call him Israel so you'll know the promise is to Israel. And in verse 3, he says, I'm going to make you into a great nation, just like he said in Genesis 12 and verse 2. The twilight of Israel, the man, coincides with the dawn of Israel, the nation. So the focus is shifting. It's shifting from a focus on a story about Jacob or a story about Joseph into a story about God at work through Israel in Egypt. It's getting us ready for the book of Exodus. Now go down to Genesis chapter 47. Genesis 47, and let's look at verses 7 through 12. Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. Do you notice how you have in a sense, sort of a showdown, a conversation between the Lord of Egypt in the eyes of everybody else and the Father of promise? And wouldn't you know it, it's the Father of promise who ends up offering the blessing. Jacob encounters Pharaoh. And here we have God through Jacob saying things could go well with you. It's kind of a precursor to what happens when Moses and Aaron show up and say to Pharaoh, this could end better if you'll just recognize who really is the Father of promise in this story. And notice that the blessing is going to come through God's covenant people. Jacob blesses Pharaoh at the beginning of the story, verse 7, and at the end of the story, verse 10. Israel blesses Egypt. That's true with Abraham. That's true with Isaac. That is, they offer blessing to the land in which they dwell. Israel is a means of blessing. Think about that. Think about the implications of that. If you are a promised vessel, God's promises are working through you, that there's this opportunity to offer blessing, even in lands you wouldn't think of. Because it turns out that Egypt needs this family. We find this in so many places in the Genesis and Exodus stories. Jacob takes the initiative. He's the sojourner. But the land of Pharaoh is at the disposal of Jacob, verses 11 and 12. The promise is at work for the family in Egypt as well as in Canaan. And so what's happening here is the writer is saying, do you remember a time when Israel showed up and Pharaoh was glad? And Pharaoh rolled out the red carpet, and Israel blessed Egypt, and Egypt prospered because of Israel. Look at how the promise of God can make great things. And then in chapter 47, beginning in verse 27, we see a full circle. We have the closure to Jacob's life with provision for his burial. It reminds us of the beginning of the story back in chapter 37, verses 1 and 2. We've already jumped quite a bit. We've jumped so many years. The story of Joseph takes place over about 17 years. And here we are, we're in Egypt, but as is the case with God's people, wherever they go, you can be in Egypt but not be of Egypt. And so the promise, the prayer, the hope is that the burial is going to take place in Canaan or Hebron. In other words, yeah, Egypt's great. It's got lots of nice, shiny things. But I'm not going to be attracted, I'm not going to be deterred by Egypt. I'll be in Egypt, but I'm not of Egypt. Burial is going to take place in Canaan. And in chapters 48 and 49, Jacob gives a blessing. Oh, his blessing extends upon child after child after child. He gives blessings. And then in chapter 50, we see the end result of reconciliation. Chapter 50, verse 1, Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh. And he talks about what he wants to do, the traveling and with his family. But look in verse 15. Verse 14. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your fathers and their sin because they did evil to you." Boy, they're just so used to trying to find ways to use their father to get out of jams. And here they are saying, your father just buried would not have wanted you to do anything other than to be nice to us about this. Please forgive the transgressions of your servants. And the text says Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I see a lot here. Reconciliation involves forgiveness of the past. That's clear. Reconciliation is rooted in God. Notice that. What God has wanted is what's going to come true. And reconciliation involves a movement into a new future. The past is the past. The bygones are bygones. But what I also notice are these are words of comfort that you can keep on your lips and in your heart and in your mind when you're wandering in the wilderness, wondering if all of this was worth it, wondering what's going to happen next, and you're reminded that when God first moved his people into Egypt, he had a plan. And when things weren't going well, the words of God through his spoken instrument were, "Don't be afraid. Even what they mean for evil, God means for good. And I will keep many people alive, and I will provide for you and your little ones." And wouldn't you know, the sending out of the children of Israel out of Egypt is the catalyst that sends them into the promised land. I bring all this to a close by asking how it relates to some key relationships. If God gives family, what do these passages teach us about our relationship to our family? For example, what do we learn in all of this about the church? Seems to me that one of the things that we can learn from all of this is that when God promises to be with Israel, wherever they go, no matter what land they're in, we see that God promises to be with his people. One of the comforting things here I see is that if we want to be with God, we need to be with his people. If you want to know where God is, find where God's people are. And so there's a relationship here. It would have been terrible for all of Joseph's brothers to end up scattered to the four winds. It would have been terrible for there to be no reconciliation because God said, "I'm going to be with Israel." What if there was no Israel to be found? And so the church gathers together and is unified together and stays together because God wants to be with his people and promises to make a great nation. What do we learn about spouses? Do you remember this passage that we read earlier in Genesis 47, in which Jacob blesses Pharaoh at the beginning and at the end. And God says, if I'm going to work through my chosen instrument, the father of promise, I'll even ask him to give a blessing to the Lord of Egypt and say, wherever I dwell, there can be peace. Apply this in your married life. This could be true for the husband or the wife. There are all kinds of situations in which there is one Christian and one is not. Or they're both Christians, but one seems to be the strong Christian at the moment and one's the weaker brother or sister. Whatever the situation is. Paul has this wonderful, wonderful phrase that feels out of place until you kind of see how it fits together in 1 Corinthians 7, this difficult passage about divorce and what do you do with children and separation, and it's all very painful. But then he says, you know, talking to a man who's married to an unbeliever, you know that God must somehow be in that house, otherwise your children would be unholy. But as it is, they are holy. You know what he means? There's a blessing in that house. If a representative of God is there, there is a blessing in that house. It's a beautiful, beautiful line to mean. I'm with you and you're with them, so in some way, I'm with them. We see that in the Egypt story. Another way of thinking about it, remember that passage that talks about how the good company or surrounding someone can influence that person? The prayers of faith that can save the sick. Those who see the hurting person and lower them down into the room. And Jesus, the text doesn't say when Jesus saw his faith. It says when he saw their faith. Mark chapter 2. He heals the man. One of the best things we can do for our spouses, besides loving them, which is really important, is to be godly to them. And in that sense, be godly for them. For where we represent Christ, there is blessing in that house. What do we learn about our relationship to our parents? Genesis 47, 27 through 31, we have the provision for burial of Jacob. And Jacob says, I would like you to take me all the way back to Canaan. And there's no passage that says, and the children all explained that they were way too busy, they had homework. It was a long trip. There was something really good on TV that night. What they say is, of course, that's what we will do. There's this sense of honor and respect, this sense of, you're the one who brought all this together. In fact, if Jacob had not taken the initiative, if he hadn't followed the promise of God, if he hadn't gone the first time or sent the second time or showed up the third time, you wonder how the story would have ended. And in response, Jacob's wishes are granted. What do we learn about our relationship to our children? Well, in Genesis 48 and 49, we have Jacob giving the blessing. It is so important that we be the kind of people that offer blessing to our children. There's a little book by Trenton Smalley called The Blessing. And one of the points in that book is that if you grew up and you received a blessing from your parents, you know it. And if you did not receive a blessing from your parents, you know it. It's an amazing gift we can give our children that says, I see something in you. I believe in you. I want to pass on something good to you, and I want to see what I've tried to work for accomplished through you, and I am behind you. I'm with you. A blessing. And then finally, what kind of relationship do we see with our siblings? Well, we see that it didn't matter what had been done. I don't know your relationship with your siblings, but I'm just curious. Did they throw you in a pit and leave you for dead? Did they sell you into slavery? And if they didn't do that, Joseph says, listen, what you meant was for evil, but God meant it for good. I'm not in the place of God. What God accomplished through all of this is greater than whatever evil you were devising. There is a future, forgiveness of the past, rooted in God, and a movement into a new future. We learn something about our relationships with each other, but of course, the source of all this is God. Yes, we should have strong relationships with the church, with our parents and our children and our siblings and our spouses, but more than all of that, as we learn about our relationship with God. God was with Joseph. God was with Jacob. God was present in Egypt. He was present in the dungeon. He was present in the furnace. He is present on the cross. He is present in the resurrection. He's present in your storms, and he's present on the day when he brings you out of your storms. Do you believe this? Have we grown in our story of Joseph to realize that God is with us in every moment? It changes how we view the moment. So our relationship with God is the bedrock for it all. I've enjoyed this study with you. Let's end with a prayer. Father, we praise your name. We're grateful to you for your goodness. Thank you for bringing so many here tonight. May your blessings be upon every member, every visitor, every student, every family member. Father, may you strengthen our resolve to be more like you towards others as you fill us with your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.